The human brain is like a work of art. There are 80 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. That's about the same as the amount of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Each one of those neurons connects to thousands of others, creating trillions of connections in the brain. These electrical pulses enable us to have a sense of self, to control our bodies, and to perform thousands of intricate tasks with ease. Despite improvements in neuroimaging, we still do not have the capacity to study every single neuron. And in fact, our technology remains pretty limited. Even if we did have the capacity to study every single neuron, our technology at times hinders us. We forget about the real people that sit behind each and every brain scan. We become fixated on what we can see, and we forget the limitations of this technology. The human brain is actually as unique as our fingerprints, or at least the functioning of it is. And that's because the way the brain functions is shaped on our own experiences. The brain is actually that complex that it's relatively easy for it to become dysfunctional. And I say this because my fascination with the human brain did not stem from my own experience as an academic and as a researcher. It stems from my personal experience. I live with a broken brain. Specifically, I live with a flat brain. And living with FND has shaped my entire life. When I was 14 years old, I caught the flu. And for me, that was pretty great. Because although I was feeling rough, it was for once a legitimate reason not to have to go to school. See, for me, school was just one more place where I didn't fit in. I didn't belong, and I was not an academic. So having the flu was a legitimate reason for me not to go. Before I recovered from the flu, I developed glandular fever, a common viral infection, also known as the kissing disease. Perhaps another insight into how I spent my time instead of being at school. Before I recovered, I was paralyzed from the neck down within 2 months of developing glandular fever. I lost my ability to move and feel from the neck down. I lost my speech as well. Worse still, there was no explanation as to why. I was 14 years old. Do you remember what it was like to be 14? You're dealing with all those complex emotions. You're tiptoeing between childhood and adulthood. Before I became ill, I craved my independence. I wanted to be heard. I felt like no one around me understood me, and I'd often say exactly that and slam the door behind me. Suddenly, I could no longer tell the world to leave me alone because I had no words at all. I craved my independence, and now I had to rely on those around me to feed me, to change me, to bathe me. And worse still, there was absolutely no explanation as to why. Why had I ended up this way? First, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, and then medically unexplained symptoms. That's not a diagnosis at all. There's something medically wrong with you, we just don't know what. And I was sent for all of the usual diagnostic tests. All of them came back with no explanation. And as a result of that, some doctors told me I was faking it. I was a teenager wanting attention. Others told me that I would never walk or talk again, and that I would never recover. When I first went to speech therapy to begin to work on my speech, the normal techniques were not working. And so instead, my speech therapist got me to work on swear words. And I cannot tell you the sense of relief I found when I finally found my voice again. And more importantly, when I could first tell someone to fuck off again. I remember my first steps for the second time in my life when I was 19 years old. But it took me 5 years to receive an official diagnosis. And that diagnosis was Functional Neurological Disorder, or FND. And living with FND really did shape my entire life. But I am not the only one. See, in my now nearly 10 years of working with those with FND, I have met and heard the stories of thousands of people with this condition. For example, the 20-year-old had a seizure at work and fell into a coma. She forgot her life from before and continues to do so every single day. Or the 35-year-old who had an epidural when they were in labor, fairly standard practice, but never regained the ability to walk or talk again. Or the many others who have suffered from viral infections, head injuries, psychological traumas, or physical injuries. One single incident completely transformed their entire lives. And worse still, all of those things are things that we are all exposed to every single day. This really could happen to any one of us. So in FND, this common condition, what happens is the surface of the brain still remains intact. So on the surface, the brain still looks like this magnificent work of art. It's the inner workings, the billions of neurons that become dysfunctional. A stressor, a trigger, a trauma, whether that is a psychological illness, a viral infection, or an injury, affects the way those billions of neurons work. You can imagine it a bit like being like a mobile phone. On the surface, the phone looks fine. It's working. There's no cracks or dents on the screen. But if the battery runs low, suddenly the programs and apps don't start to work as they should. They begin to crash and become dysfunctional. Perhaps they even begin to impact upon the other areas of the phone. In FND, the brain has become flat, dysfunctional, disconnected, and unable to work as it should. But this is not a rare condition that I am talking about. This is very common. In fact, FND is the second most common diagnosis in neurology settings. The symptoms of FND vary from person to person because the brain is so unique and based on our experiences. Some people might have functional paralysis or movement difficulties. Others might have swallowing and speech dysfunction. Some might have functional blindness or deafness, seizures, tics, paralysis, convulsions. FND does not discriminate. It can impact anyone of any age, gender, or any other social or biologically constructed category. The truth is, the inconvenient truth is that FND can happen to anyone, and so suddenly, and completely transform their entire life. I remember being 19 years old and sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus, and I was in my wheelchair. The bus arrived and it was full. There was no space for me to get on with my chair. Seems like a minor inconvenience. I waited the 20 or so minutes for the next bus. Bus after bus arrived and they were full. What seems like a minor inconvenience was now my entire life. There was no space for me in society. There was no space for me and my disability. But there was no space for me in education either. I was told that I was too complicated to support, that I could not, that I would not succeed. I left school with no qualifications because they were unable to support me. But there was no space for me in medicine either. I was just a burden. I was an inconvenient, misunderstood person, and they offered no help or support. At first, my symptoms were dismissed as being typical for a teenager, and later, typical for a woman. I'd like to see how they justify paralysis as being typical for anyone. One paper that surveyed medical professionals and clinicians reported that FND was their least liked condition. They see it as a burden. They think there is no hope, that those with FND are beyond hope and beyond help and beyond support. But I am living proof that this illness is not impossible. They just need to stop and listen to what the narratives of those who are living with the condition, because they are the real experts in this. There should not be no space if we create space. And then I began to work as an emerging academic when I was an undergraduate. And I looked to the literature, because scientific literature, there should be space there. But again, there was no space. The literature in FND was extremely limited, and of what did exist, there seemed to be two main lines of argument. On one side, people were trying to show that those with FND were faking it, that they were feigning their symptoms, something which would be seen as extremely unethical in any other medical or mental health condition. Yet somehow with FND, that was possible. On the other side of the argument were those who claimed that FND was fascinating, that this condition could unlock some of the mysteries of the human mind, the way the brain worked, unlock mysteries about consciousness. But it does not feel fascinating when you live with FND. My own research, from my undergraduate through to my master's and to my PhD, shows that FND is a distinct condition, that there are differences in brain activity in those with FND that make it a condition in its own right. This is not a medical mystery. Not only that, but it shows that the brain is impacted in FND. There are real measurable differences in brain activity that make it distinct from those with healthy conditions and other long-term conditions. It also shows that there's a role of things like dissociation and inflammation, possibly biochemistry dysfunctions too. But I am not special or unique for finding these things. I firmly believe that those before me would have found them too, if only they had stopped and looked and listened to the real lived experiences of those diagnosed. And that is why I advocate for collaborative research with the communities that research is actually about. Even now, after advocating for this condition for nearly a decade, I am still met with stigma. This is still a misunderstood condition, even though it's extremely common. But it is not a new condition. This has been talked about since Plato's time. Early physicians claimed that this was a female problem. It stems from hysteria, sorcery, witchcraft, demonic possession. All of these things are still things that I am having to fight against. Myself and others who advocate for this condition are still fighting that very stigma today. FND remains undiscussed in medical circles and in educational curriculums, particularly in healthcare and in psychology, even though it is so desperately needed there. It's for this reason that I have dedicated my life and my career to supporting those with FND. I proudly support FND Dimensions, and there we have created space. We should not have had to create a space separate from society, but we did and we do. We create space where people can share their experiences, where they can learn from one another, where they can also fill their brains with things that we know that research has shown us helps the brain to heal. Because social support and understanding and being believed were some of the steps that I had to take on my own illness journey. As much as a good diet and nutrition and sleep and all of those other wonderful things is good for the brain. At the end of the day, it comes down to brain health. One thing that we very often don't discuss about health is brain health, but brain health is health. It's all about the things that we can do to help the brain to heal, to help the brain to recover. These are all things that I have done throughout my illness journey to help me to get to where I am now. And yes, I apply neuropsychological techniques to my own life. Of course I do. Things like pacing and grounding. I even have alarms set on my phone to remind me to eat or to hydrate because I don't receive those signals from my body still. I can't distinguish between hot and cold, so I have to rely on visual cues in my environment to help me. I will do things to expose my brain to new experiences. So things like learning to ride a bike again, it's not going too well, to work on my spatial awareness. Exposing your brain to new experiences helps it to heal. But now I stand here and I share my story, because often my story gets hailed as a headline anyway. The girl who learned to walk again, the neuropsychologist who fixed her brain, but I am still working on connecting my body with my brain again. It takes time and it takes patience, but we need to create a space with those of FND so that they can do so. I also share my story so that those with FND know that they are not alone, that this is not all in their head, and that I will stand beside them. I share my story to create ripples of conversation. And I ask you all to please tell one more person about FND so that we can turn these ripples of conversation into waves of support for those diagnosed, so that we can change the landscape for those who live with FND and other long-term conditions. Thank you.